Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world of mud-soaked boots, echoing hooves, and medieval glory. But before you get too comfortable, let me be real with you. You probably won't survive this. Not the story, obviously. You'll make it through that, assuming you stay awake. But if you were actually living in medieval Europe with no land, no title, and nothing but a second-hand tunic and dreams of greatness, yeah, sorry. Game over by age 25, tops. Dysentery or a sword, take your pick. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean it. No pity clicks. And hey, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in the comments. I love knowing which city I'm lulling to sleep at 2:12 AM. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not nobility, you're not even gentry. You're just a third son of a third son with the good fortune to be born into the household of a minor knight. A nobody, really. Somewhere in the Anglo-Norman borderlands of the 12th century. Your name is William. No last name because you haven't earned one yet. You've got a strong jaw, quick eyes, and the good sense to keep your mouth shut around people with swords. Your father dies disgraced. Some political fumble that leaves your family with nothing but a broken shield and the vague smell of debt. At 11 years old, you're a ward of the king, not the golden path you might imagine. More like glorified hostage meets unwanted house guest. You eat what the cooks leave over, train when allowed, and sleep in whatever corner doesn't smell of urine. Yet, you observe. You memorize the footwork of knights. You note the words they say before drawing their blades, and after. That's your real training. By 15, you're thrown into your first real fight. Not a grand war, but a quick skirmish. A noble's son thinks it'll be funny to knock the wind out of the penniless boy. Instead, you break his collarbone. That gets noticed. Soon, you're given a half-broken horse and a real weapon. You become a knight, though the title feels more honorary than useful. No land, no wealth, just your name, and that's still barely yours. Then comes Eleanor of Aquitaine. Yes, that Eleanor. Queen of France, then England, Duchess of just about everything. She sees something in you, something sharp beneath the dirt. She arranges for you to serve her son, Henry the young king, and now you're caught up in the ridiculous soap opera that is the Angevin royal family. You fight duels for honour. You chase rebellious lords. You clean up Henry's messes, literally sometimes. Here's the thing about you, though. You're honest, almost painfully so. That makes you rare in this world of conniving counts and backstabbing bishops. And loyalty, you've got it in bucketfuls. When Henry dies of dysentery, see what I meant earlier, you make good on your promise. You ride his body back through enemy territory, honour intact, sword unsheathed. You're not paid to do this. There's no reward waiting at the end. But people see, they remember. In a world where loyalty is currency, yours is suddenly solid gold. That's when your rise really begins. Richard the Lionheart, Eleanor's other son, takes the throne, and you're knighted again, this time for real. Land, title, the works. Suddenly you're William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke. Not too shabby for a guy who started life sleeping in the stables. Here's your fun, slightly unhinged fact of the night. William once fought in over 500 tournaments, and not the staged Hollywood ones. These were full-contact, chaotic melees where dozens of knights smashed into each other for fame and loot. William never lost. Never. He once even got into a duel using only a blunted sword and broke 5 of his opponent's ribs, because why not? Now, the scholarly debate, and it's a juicy one. How much of William Marshal's story is truth, and how much is polished PR? His biography was written not long after his death, commissioned by his own family and full of heroic flourishes. Was he really the unbeatable chivalric paragon history remembers, or just the best brand manager of his generation? Either way, you've got to respect the hustle. By the time you're in your 70s, a wild age to reach in medieval Europe, you've served 5 kings, you've raised armies, you've negotiated treaties. At one point, you become regent of all England, that's right. From penniless boy to the man literally holding the crown together after a royal death. Your last act? Leading troops into battle, at 71. You have to be tied to your horse so you won't fall off mid-charge, and you still win. Because of course you do. As you lie dying, you're offered the robes of a Templar knight. You accept. One final twist in your wild life story. You're buried in the Temple Church in London, and your tomb becomes a place of legend, a quiet slab among whispers of what's possible when grit, loyalty, and not a little luck collide. And now, centuries later, you lie beneath stone, anonymous no longer. Sir William Marshal, the stableboy who became England's greatest knight. You're barefoot in the mud, herding pigs through the damp forests and tangled fields of medieval Bulgaria. The year is 1277, and your name is Ivailo, though no one says it with much respect. To them you're just the pig boy, the kind who sleeps under carts and eats whatever's left after the grain merchants have had their fill. You're poor, peasant poor. You own nothing but a rough tunic and a stubborn spirit. Your hands are calloused, your ribs visible, and your mind always busy chewing on the fact that the nobles are choking your country with their greed. Life is cruel, but you've got a mouth on you. At village fires and market corners you begin to talk, not loud or foolish, just enough to be heard. You complain about the boyars, the Bulgarian nobility, who drink wine while others drink rainwater. You speak of change, of fairness. At first, people scoff, but then winter hits hard. Crops fail. The Mongols raid. Starving families start to listen. Soon you become more than a pig herder with opinions. You're a voice, then a leader, and then, somehow, a warlord. It begins with a few dozen angry men, pitchforks, hatchets, scythes repurposed into spears. You lead them in ambushes, in night raids, in skirmishes that turn into revolts. You know the land better than the noble-born commanders. You use it. Swamps become allies. Hills become traps. Your numbers grow. Peasants, disgruntled soldiers, even monks join your cause. The name Ivailo starts to spread like fire across wet wood. It smoulders, then burns, and now you're standing outside Tarnovo, the capital of the Bulgarian Empire. You, a former pig boy, besiege the royal city, and you win. Because of course you do. The Tsar, Constantine Tik, has ruled from his throne with a broken spine and a broken empire. He's paralysed both physically and politically, and you're anything but. You march into the capital not as a beggar but as a revolutionary. You marry the Tsar's widow, because medieval politics are nothing if not dramatic, and claim the throne. Congratulations, you're Tsar Ivailo of Bulgaria. Long may you reign. Though, well, probably not. Here's your quirky footnote of the night. Ivailo was nicknamed Bardukva, which means lettuce in Bulgarian. No one knows exactly why. Maybe it was a joke, maybe it was his favourite food, or maybe medieval peasant leaders just had really unfortunate PR. As ruler, you try to hold it together. You beat back the Mongols twice. You defy both foreign invaders and the backstabbing boyars who would rather see the empire collapse than obey a commoner. You attempt reforms. You try to be fair. You really try. But you're surrounded. Byzantines to the south, Mongols to the north, and the nobles, always the nobles, undermining you at every turn. Eventually they drive you out. You flee to the Mongol Golden Horde, thinking maybe you can cut a deal. That's not your best move. You vanish from history shortly after. Some say you were murdered, others say you were imprisoned. Some romanticise that you went back to herding pigs in peace. Here's where scholars disagree. Was Ivailo a genuine populist hero, the first of his kind in Europe? Or just a lucky rebel who rode a wave of chaos until it drowned him? No royal blood, no divine claim, just a man who dared to flip the hierarchy on its head. Either way, you changed the game. You were a peasant who ruled, for a moment. In a time when kings were born in silk, not mud, that's the kind of miracle that makes historians sweat and priests squint uncomfortably at their Bibles. And your story? It survives in whispers, in legends, in the stunned confusion of later scribes who have to write the words swineherd turned Tsar into official chronicles without laughing or crying. You taught the world something that night by the fireside when you first opened your mouth and let your rage turn into purpose. Power listens when the hungry shout loud enough, even if only for a short time. Even if you wore a crown made of storms, you're standing in a crumbling piazza in Florence, barefoot on the cobblestones, robes soaked from a sudden downpour that doesn't seem to bother you. Around you, a crowd has gathered. Merchants with gold rings, weavers with tired hands, barefoot children too young to understand the weight of your words. You lift your arms and speak. Your voice isn't loud, but it cuts through the drizzle like a blade. You preach fire and brimstone, but not just the heavenly kind. You talk about Florence, its corruption, its vanities, its obsession with wealth and naked marble statues. You call it a second Babylon, a nest of sin. You're Girolamo Savonarola, and Florence is listening. Let's rewind. You're not from Florence originally. You're from Ferrara, born into a family of minor nobility, the kind with enough prestige to name drop, but not enough to avoid debt collectors. You study medicine, but your heart isn't in it. You're more drawn to the writings of the prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, the ones who shouted warnings and made everyone uncomfortable. At 23, you walk away from the world. You join the Dominican order. Silence, discipline, self-denial. You fast, you study, you mortify the flesh. All of it, every minute, is preparation. You don't know it yet, but you're building a voice that will one day bring a Renaissance city to its knees. You first arrive in Florence in the 1480s, but you're not an instant hit. Too intense, too dark. Your sermons sound like doom metal to people used to angelic choirs. But something shifts. Florence, rich, chaotic, bursting with art and anxiety, starts to fracture. The Medici's grip weakens. The French are invading. The Pope is juggling bribes and armies like flaming batons. And there you are, a skinny friar with a haunted face stepping into the chaos like you were born for it. You start predicting things, wars, deaths, political changes. And when they come true, eerily true, your voice gains thunder. People pour into the cathedral to hear you, not just peasants either, bankers, artists. Michelangelo is rumoured to have wept during one of your sermons. Botticelli, they say, burned his own paintings after hearing you. You are everywhere, and everything. A prophet with a spine of steel and no patience for luxury. Then comes your infamous moment, the bonfire of the vanities. You organise it like a man organising Judgment Day. Children go door to door collecting sinful items. Mirrors, makeup, costumes, love poetry, chessboards, paintings of Venus and Apollo too. The people bring it all, mountains of it. They pile it high in the Piazza della Signoria, then they set it on fire. The flames climb into the sky, carrying beauty and madness together into the wind. Here's a wild little footnote to keep you up at night. Among the items reportedly tossed into the flames were original works by masters of the Renaissance, things we will never see, because one fiery sermon turned Florence into an open-air altar. But not everyone is thrilled. Rome is watching. Pope Alexander VI, yes, the Borgia one, does not like what he hears. You're preaching against corruption, against the Pope himself. That's dangerous. He warns you. You don't back down. He threatens. You raise your voice louder. He excommunicates you. And still, you preach. Until one day it all collapses. The crowds grow uneasy. The French, whom you once welcomed as instruments of God's will, are gone. The Medici regroup. The people want art again, parties, carnival, laughter. And you? You're a grim whisper at a time when Florence wants music. You're arrested, tortured, made to confess. They hang you, then burn your body in the same square where your bonfire once raged. They scatter your ashes in the river to prevent your followers from keeping relics. And yet relics appear anyway. A splinter from your robe, a lock of hair. Hope is hard to drown. Now, the academic debate, and it's a spicy one. Was Savonarola a brave reformer centuries ahead of the Reformation, or just a religious zealot with a messiah complex? Some historians paint him as a martyr of conscience, others as a tyrant in monk's robes. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between flame and shadow. But tonight, as you curl up in your cell for the final time, knowing the morning sun will not rise for you, there's a strange peace. You never wanted fame, you wanted change, and for a few years, impossibly, a barefoot friar made the richest city in Europe kneel. You, Girolamo Savonarola, screamed against the thunder, and for a little while, the thunder answered back. You're born into heat, dust, and the smells of old scrolls and sweating livestock somewhere along the ragged edge of the Maghreb, in North Africa. You don't belong to a royal house or a great merchant clan. Your family is respectable but modest. You're the kind of kid no one expects much from, except maybe to work in the family trade. But you're sharper than the other kids. Your mind is restless. While others are content learning prayers, you ask why the stars move the way they do. Why some empires rise and others crumble. Why men go to war for things that rot in time. You're the descendant of Andalusian refugees, brought south after the Christian kingdoms pushed into Muslim Spain. Your blood is full of exile, and your brain is full of questions. Your name will not be famous yet, but you belong to the family line of the man who will one day become Ibn Khaldun, the father of modern sociology, a court insider, a survivor, and an observer of history itself. Let's get our bearings. It's the 14th century, and the Islamic world is fractured into sultanates, dynasties, and shifting loyalties. The Maghreb, modern-day Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, is a place of splintered rule, poetic language, and enough political betrayals to make a soap opera writer blush. You grow up with a mix of Berber tradition, Arab scholarship, and old-school Andalusian elegance. It's a heady cocktail, and you drink deep. You study, and then study more. Language, logic, law, philosophy, theology. You memorize whole books. You debate teachers. You develop a reputation, not for being loud, but for being uncomfortably intelligent. You start writing, of course, but more importantly, you listen to travellers, to elders, to soldiers and merchants, and everything you hear you file away. You enter politics because, well, how else does a brilliant young man move up in a world where poetry can earn you an audience with a king? You attach yourself to a few rulers, carefully. You play the court game like chess, always 3 moves ahead, never trusting too much, never too loyal to any one master. It's not noble, maybe, but it keeps you alive. Eventually you become a vizier. That's right, chief counselor, the guy behind the curtain. You draft treaties, manage state secrets, and sometimes reluctantly send men to their deaths. The throne room becomes your office. You wear silk now. You speak carefully. People bow when they enter. But here's the strange twist. The closer you get to power, the more disgusted you become by it. You see kings crumble from within. You see empires collapse under the weight of their own luxury. You don't just observe it, you analyse it. You begin to write your grand theory, that civilizations rise, grow fat, forget how to suffer and then die. The cycle of history is a living thing, you argue, and you are one of the first humans to say it like that. Here's your wonderfully odd fact of the night. Ibn Khaldun, your famous descendant and possibly your role in this ancestral journey, once interviewed Timur the Lame, the warlord who carved through Asia like a plague on horseback. While everyone else was shaking in their slippers, Khaldun walked into Timur's tent and calmly discussed history, society, and why people conquer things. Timur was so impressed he didn't kill him. That's a flex. As for the scholarly debate, historians can't quite agree whether Ibn Khaldun, and by extension the kind of figures like you, were true reformers or just cynical survivors. Was the writing a revolutionary act of intellect, or a safety valve, a way to let out frustration without risking the sword? Some argue he was the first modern thinker. Others say he was a medieval bureaucrat who got lucky with eloquence. Either way, you sit alone in your room at night, candle flickering, as you scratch ink across parchment, chasing a truth that no king can ever hold. And eventually the world will catch up. Centuries later, your ideas will be dusted off by European Enlightenment thinkers. Economists will marvel at your theories of labour and value. Sociologists will study your ideas of social cohesion. But back here, in your time, you're mostly seen as the weird guy who writes essays about how cities rot from the inside out. And you keep doing it, even when you're forgotten. Because you're not chasing fame, you're chasing patterns. That's what makes you dangerous. At the end of your life, whether you die of fever in a seaside town or quietly in your sleep among books, your name is already being whispered beyond your region. One day, people will call you the first person to think about history not as a divine chessboard, but as a system. Not as myth, but as motion. So yes, you started with nothing. Just a family name dented by exile and a mind buzzing with unwelcome questions. But in the end, you mapped the rise and fall of empires with nothing but observation and ink. You rose, not through war or marriage or a throne, but through thought. And in a world ruled by swords, that may be the most unlikely rise of all. You're not royalty, not even close. You're a widow, barely 30, and the men in your life keep dying in very suspicious ways. Your name is Olga, just Olga for now, and you live in the smoky chill of 10th century Kievan Rus, a place where warriors bleed over trade routes and cities rise beside frozen rivers. Your story doesn't begin in a palace, but somewhere quieter, on the edges of history, where women are expected to mourn, bear sons and stay out of strategy. You do none of those things quietly. Let's rewind. You married well, or at least you married up. Your husband is Igor of Kiev, ruler of a growing power wedged between the collapsing Khazars and the rising Byzantines. It's not love, but it's opportunity. You play the role well, bearing him a son, Sviatoslav, and managing the household with calm calculation. But Igor is reckless. He goes to collect tribute from the Drevlians, a neighbouring tribe, and gets himself torn apart by angry locals. Literally. They bend two trees, tie him between them, and let nature do the rest. And now you're a young widow with a baby heir, surrounded by opportunistic boyars and enemies who smell blood in the water. The Drevlians make a mistake. They send a marriage proposal. One of their nobles comes to your court with a grin and a message. Marry their prince, and all will be forgiven. You smile. You say sure. Then you have them buried alive in a trench. The Drevlians, still clueless, send more emissaries. You say, let's talk in a bathhouse. They agree. You lock the doors and set the building on fire. That's right, you're not just grieving, you're making a point. You then march your army straight to the Drevlian capital. They surrender, begging forgiveness. You ask for 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house, a harmless-seeming tribute. They oblige. You tie bits of sulphur and cloth to each bird, set them alight and release them. The birds fly home, the city goes up in flames. Not a fairy tale, not a metaphor. Just a woman making history the only way she can, with fire, strategy, and a terrifying sense of balance. Your quirky fact tonight: you are one of the few women in medieval history officially canonized as a saint by the Eastern Orthodox Church, after massacring thousands. They call you Saint Olga, equal to the Apostles. Equal to the Apostles. For the record, there are 0 other saints who also committed flaming bird-based warfare. So there's that. Once you've secured your son's throne, you don't vanish. You travel to Constantinople, the beating heart of the Byzantine world, to study Christianity up close. The emperor is impressed. You're regal, clever, unshakable. He proposes marriage. You politely decline and request baptism instead. He agrees. Once baptized, you smile and say, "Now, I'm your spiritual daughter," which makes marriage a bit awkward. You've just checkmated the Emperor of Byzantium with holy paperwork. You return to Kiev a baptized Christian, but your son won't follow. Sviatoslav is more into swords than saints. Still, you plant the seed. When your grandson Vladimir eventually converts and baptizes all of Kievan Rus, it's your legacy he builds on. You laid the foundation for one of the largest Christian conversions in medieval history, all while being underestimated at every turn. Now for the debate historians keep chewing on, was Olga truly devout, or was Christianity just another lever of power? Some scholars argue she saw in the church a new structure, one more flexible, more organised, and better suited to unifying the Slavic tribes under a single ideology. Others think she was sincere, that after years of blood and vengeance she sought peace through prayer. Maybe both are true. You're complicated like that. You end your life in a strong position, unheard of for women in your time. You rule until your son is old enough to take over, and even then you continue to advise him. When you die, it's not with regret, but with legacy. Kievan Rus is stronger, more centralised, and on the road to becoming something greater. Your grandson will become Vladimir the Great. Your descendants will stretch all the way into Imperial Russia. But none of that would exist without you. The woman who buried diplomats, burned cities and converted kingdoms. A widow, a strategist, a saint. Equal to the Apostles. You never raised a sword yourself, but kingdoms bowed all the same. And for a woman born in obscurity, that's the kind of rise no fairy tale could ever touch. You're born the son of a peasant foot soldier, in a village so small it doesn't even make it onto the imperial maps. Your home is a thatched roof hut somewhere in the quiet, sun-drenched rice paddies of Owari province, in the smouldering middle of 16th century Japan. Your father dies when you're young. Your older brother takes over the family, but there isn't much to lead. Just enough rice to avoid starving and a handful of gossip from passing soldiers. You have no money, no education, no connections, but you do have something most peasants don't. Ambition so raw, it keeps you awake at night. Your name is Hideyoshi, and you are not supposed to matter. You run away as a boy, leaving behind your family and your meagre future to seek service under a rising lord, Oda Nobunaga. He's a ruthless warlord with a flair for chaos and a nose for talent. You start by cleaning boots, literally. You shine Nobunaga's armour, patch his tents, feed his horses. You are known mockingly as Saru, the monkey, for your lanky frame and nimble fingers. People laugh, you let them, but you pay attention. You notice things other people ignore, how Nobunaga moves his troops, how messengers are treated, where supplies come from. Slowly, quietly, you begin to climb. You're made a sandal bearer, then a page, then a messenger, and before long you're entrusted with real duties, managing troops, organising provisions, even negotiating deals with local lords. You never learn to read like a noble, but you understand people, and that is much rarer. And then comes your first miracle. Nobunaga sends you to secure a castle. You don't just take it, you charm it out of the lord's hands without bloodshed. Everyone expected you to fail or die. Instead, you make it look effortless. You return to camp with a new ally and 0 casualties. Nobunaga is amused and intrigued. Your rise becomes steep. You're given command of troops. You prove yourself in siege after siege, battle after battle. You're clever, unpredictable. You use floodwaters to trap enemies. You bribe commanders instead of fighting them. You once sneak a whole army up a cliff during the night just to shock a garrison into surrender. You start winning more than the noble-born generals. And here's the quirky little gem of your life. You love tea, like really love it. You study the art of the tea ceremony with religious devotion. You collect rare teapots the way other men collect blades. Eventually you build a golden tea room. Not a metaphor, a literal tea room coated in gold leaf. War and strategy might make you famous, but tea makes you divine. After Nobunaga dies, ambushed by one of his own men, you move fast. Too fast for anyone to stop you. You avenge him with surgical precision, crush his killer, and seize control of the fractured Oda forces before the nobles can even agree on what happened. You're not just a general now, you're the power behind the throne. But of course that's not enough. You take over Kyoto, you build a castle so massive and ornate, it becomes a symbol of national unity. You defeat your rivals one by one, marching from region to region, castle to castle, until the whole fractured land begins to kneel. You become the Kampaku, the imperial regent, technically still under the emperor, but in practice, you're the most powerful man in Japan. And the best part, you were born without a surname, so you give yourself one, Toyotomi. Now nobles are forced to bow to a man they once called Monkey Boy. Now here's where historians like to argue. Was your rise really proof of Japan's meritocracy? Or were you a rare exception in a system still choking on samurai arrogance? Some scholars say you broke class boundaries and brought in a golden age. Others say you climbed the ladder only to pull it up behind you, solidifying power in your family, banning peasants from owning weapons and reinforcing the very hierarchies you shattered. There's truth in both. You build a legacy too large to contain. You unify Japan, truly, finally. You launch invasions of Korea, though they go badly and drain your coffers. You rule as absolute authority, mixing military control with lavish court spectacle. And all the while, you sip tea in your gold room and wonder, maybe, what the rice paddies of your youth might look like now. When death comes, you try to secure your legacy. You appoint a council to protect your young son, but within a few years it all unravels. Your line is wiped out. A new shogun rises. Your name becomes legend and cautionary tale all at once. But none of that changes this simple truth. You were born with nothing, not even a surname, and you died with an entire country under your control. You proved that even in the rigid, armour-clad world of feudal Japan, someone from the fields could climb all the way to the top and force history to bow. You, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the barefoot monkey boy, became the man who unified a nation. You're born into silk sheets and golden trimmings, but only for a moment. Then you throw them all away. Your father is a wealthy cloth merchant in the Italian town of Assisi. Upper middle class, the kind of man who makes sure everyone knows how many bolts of imported velvet he's sold this quarter. You're named Giovanni, but everyone calls you Francesco, the Frenchman, thanks to your mum's background and your father's dreams of cross-border trade. You're clever, charming, fashionable. You wear the best tunics, dine on meat regularly, and spend your nights throwing coins at minstrels and laughing your way down cobbled streets. You're living the dream, until you're not. War breaks out. You sign up. You're going to be a knight. You have the armour, the attitude, the Instagrammable swagger, if Instagram existed. But the dream unravels fast. You're captured, thrown into a prison. left to rot with infected wounds and worse food than the pigs back home, you have nothing but time, and something starts to change. You begin to think, really think about everything, about who you are, about why your expensive boots never actually kept you warm. You come home sick, broken, and different, and then comes the moment. You're walking past a leper on the road. Someone society tells you to fear, to avoid, to loathe. But instead of flinching, you walk right up and kiss him on the cheek, not because someone told you to, not because you're trying to prove something, but because for the first time you see a human being instead of a disease. That's when the real transformation begins. You start giving away your clothes. You pray in half-ruined churches. You talk to animals. Seriously, birds follow you like groupies. Your father is furious. You're wrecking the family name, the business, the brand. He drags you to court. You respond by stripping naked in the public square, handing him your last garment, and walking away utterly free. From that point on, you become Francis, not just by name, but by calling. You live as a beggar, not because you have to, but because you want to. You eat scraps, sleep under trees, and wander the countryside barefoot. But people notice, first a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Your words are simple, but somehow revolutionary. Love, humility, poverty, joy. You preach to the poor and to the powerful. You ask nothing. You offer everything. Even animals stop to listen. There's an actual story, quirky, possibly exaggerated, but charming nonetheless, about how you once preached to a flock of birds and they all fell silent, listening. Another tale has you taming a man-eating wolf by simply talking to it like an old friend. Whether true or not, you've got to admire the PR. Soon, followers begin to gather. Young men and women who, like you, are done chasing gold and hunger instead for meaning. You don't start a revolution with swords or proclamations. You start it by walking humbly through a world that's forgotten how to feel anything but greed. Eventually the church notices. It doesn't know what to do with you. You're popular, sure, but dangerous. You make cardinals uncomfortable. But you're also devout, obedient, and here's the twist. Never once critical of the institution. So they let you be. The Pope gives you his blessing. And just like that, your ragtag group of barefoot idealists becomes the Franciscan order. Now here's your debate of the night. Was Francis truly opposed to wealth, or was he just creating an alternative path to power? Some scholars argue that his simplicity was radical, threatening the entire structure of the medieval church. Others see him as a holy fool, useful to the church precisely because he never called for its reform, only for personal transformation. It's hard to say. You were complex, contradictory. That's what made you powerful. Later in life you start having visions, stigmata, wounds like Christ's, appear on your hands and feet. You hide them at first, but eventually word gets out. People flock to see you, not as a preacher now, but as a living saint. You don't revel in the attention. If anything, it wears you down. Your health deteriorates. Your eyes go blind. Your bones ache from sleeping on stones and walking barefoot for decades. But you never stop. When death comes, it finds you lying on the bare earth, singing. You welcome it like an old friend. You don't leave behind wealth or a crown, but your influence, it stretches across continents, across centuries. Today, your name, Francis, is still whispered in moments of hope and simplicity. You're the patron saint of animals, of nature, of the poor, and of people trying to figure out how to do more with less. So yes, you started in silk, but you found your power in burlap and dirt. You traded gold for grace, and in doing so, you became one of the most beloved figures in all of Christian history. You, Francis of Assisi, are the beggar who became a saint, not by conquering the world, but by walking away from it. You're just a kid in Florence sweeping sawdust from the floor of a goldsmith's shop, watching adults barter over glittering brooches and the cost of opulence. Your hands are too small for a hammer, but they're good for polishing and running errands, and your eyes, they miss nothing. You watch customers enter with hungry eyes and leave with lighter purses. You listen to nobles discuss taxes they plan to dodge, and artists muse about God while sipping wine they haven't paid for. The city pulses with contradiction, beauty and rot, faith and profit, and you, a quiet little apprentice, are soaking it all in like it's your inheritance. Your name is Cosimo, and you're from the Medici family. Not yet the Medicis, mind you, but doing okay. Your father, Giovanni de' Beci, runs a small bank. Respectable, not glamorous. His office is dusty. His clients are cautious. He believes in quiet influence, subtle leverage, and counting coins twice. He doesn't chase after nobles. He waits for them to need him. And you watch, learn, and dream bigger. By your teens, you're already smarter than most of the older clerks. You understand risk. You understand power. And most importantly, you understand that money, if wielded carefully, can buy things even swords cannot. Not just land or houses, loyalty. And once you have that, you have everything. Florence is ruled by merchant oligarchs who pretend not to be oligarchs. There are guilds and councils and voting and all the usual theatre of republicanism, but really, power's up for grabs if you know how to smile while quietly taking it. And Cosimo Medici, you're about to grab it all. You begin making strategic loans, carefully, slowly. A bishop here, a minor noble there. When they can't repay, you don't ruin them, you offer extensions. Forgiveness, friendship, and just like that, you own them. They speak your name in halls of government with reverence. Our dear friend Cosimo, they say, as if they weren't on their knees to you 2 months ago. And then the Vatican comes knocking. Literally. The Pope needs a reliable bank. You oblige. You make sure every loan the Church requests is processed with divine punctuality and a good interest rate. Suddenly, the Medici Bank is managing the finances of the most powerful institution in Europe. You're not just a local player anymore, you're the banker of God. But of course, success brings enemies. The Albizzi family, old money, old power, doesn't like how fast you're climbing. They accuse you of corruption, bribery, destabilizing the Republic. You're arrested, exiled. Florence spits you out like a bad fig. You flee, humiliated but breathing. And then you wait. A year later, the city begs you to return. Turns out, it's hard to keep the wheels turning without the man who held all the gears. You come back not as a victim, but as a legend. People cheer in the streets. The Albassi are gone. You're in. Fully. Completely. Unquestionably in. Now, here's where your story gets gilded. You don't take power openly. That would be vulgar. You rule behind the scenes. You advise. You recommend. You fund artists and architects. Brunelleschi builds that impossible dome on the Florence Cathedral with your money. You pay painters to turn walls into miracles. Donatello, Fra Angelico. You fund libraries, sponsor scholars, collect manuscripts like their currency. You make Florence beautiful, and in doing so, you make yourself untouchable. Your quirky footnote for tonight? You were once such a fan of manuscripts that you funded agents to scour monastic libraries across Europe, hunting down ancient texts to bring home. You weren't just collecting books, you were rescuing lost knowledge. Florence wasn't just rich in gold anymore, it was dripping in wisdom. Now for the academic squabble. Were you a benevolent patron or a master manipulator? Some historians argue that your kindness was calculated, your generosity a tool for control. You didn't run Florence by law, you ran it by gratitude and quiet terror. Others see you as a rare figure, someone who used wealth to create instead of destroy. A man who believed in the power of beauty and ideas, not just coins. When you finally die, it's not with a sword in your hand or a crown on your head, but your funeral is more grand than any king's. All of Florence turns out. They call you Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland. Not bad for a banker's kid with good ears and a gift for humility-tinged domination. You, Cosimo de' Medici, turned a modest banking operation into the economic engine of the Renaissance. You made Florence the envy of Europe. You showed the world that true power doesn't shout, it invests. And somehow you pulled it all off without wearing armour or holding office. Just a pen, a ledger, and an uncanny ability to see 15 moves ahead on a board no one else even knew they were playing on. You're a teenager, sitting on the cold stone floor of a slave market, wrists bound with rough rope, watching strangers haggle over your worth like you're a bundle of wheat. You don't speak the language, you barely understand what's happening. One day you're picking flowers in a sunlit field somewhere in the Ruthenian countryside, maybe near modern-day Ukraine, and the next you're in chains, shoved into a caravan bound for Constantinople. Or maybe it's Crimea first, or the Balkans. It's hard to remember through the blur of tears and hunger. What's clear is this. Your name is gone, your past erased, and your future now belongs to someone else. But what no one sees yet, not the man inspecting your teeth, not the harem keeper who eventually purchases you, not even the Sultan himself, is that inside you simmers a fierce, luminous will. They rename you Hürrem. It means the cheerful one. It's a name that becomes ironic and prophetic all at once. The man you now belong to is Sultan Suleiman, ruler of the Ottoman Empire at its apex. He's powerful, cultured, terrifying. And you? You're brought to his harem like countless others before you. You're expected to be beautiful, obedient, and utterly forgettable. But you, Hürrem, who European historians will call Roxolana, you're not interested in being forgotten. You learn fast. The language, the customs, the subtle hierarchies of palace life. You figure out who to trust, who to flatter, and who to never turn your back on. You rise. First you catch the Sultan's attention, then his affection, then something rarer still, his trust. And then you break every unspoken rule. You don't just become his favourite concubine, you become his wife. Legally, publicly, historically, the first in centuries. Ottoman sultans don't marry. That's the rule. Consorts are for pleasure. Wives are a Western luxury. But you change that. You move into the Topkapi Palace. Not the harem section, but the imperial quarters. You start writing letters to European leaders. In your own hand. You become, in effect, the empress of a world where empresses aren't supposed to exist. And you don't stop there. You begin reshaping court politics. You forge alliances, eliminate rivals, some quietly, others not so quietly, and ensure your sons, not the ones born from other concubines, have the best shot at succession. And in this empire, succession is a blood sport. Brothers kill brothers. You play the game with terrifying precision, random raids. Monks start praying for your health instead of your demise. Your name starts circulating in the markets, not as a threat but as a possibility. You declare yourself king of pagan. Some laugh, some try to kill you, but you hold your ground. You build roads. You repair irrigation canals. You do something rare for a man with a sword and a past. You govern. And then something changes you. A single scroll. A missionary monk hands you a text. The Tripitaka, the central scripture of Theravada Buddhism. You read, or have someone read it to you, and it floors you. This isn't just ritual. It's philosophy. It's discipline. It's a vision of order, clarity, and balance that your fractured kingdom desperately needs. You convert on the spot. But you don't just become a Buddhist king. You become the Buddhist king. You launch a campaign, not of conquest, but of reform. You adopt Theravada Buddhism as your kingdom's official religion. You send emissaries to Sri Lanka for more authentic teachings. You invite monks. You build temples. Hundreds of them. Giant ones, intricate ones. Pagodas that shimmer under the sun. Pagan transforms from a dusty town into a glittering capital of Buddhist architecture. And here's your delightfully nerdy footnote. Anarata was so obsessed with correct doctrine that he sent a full diplomatic mission to Sri Lanka just to bring back a proper set of scriptures. Imagine a medieval king sending an embassy across the ocean just to check the footnotes. That's your level of commitment. Now, the debate. And oh, it's a spicy one. Was Anarata a devout reformer, or a political opportunist cloaking conquest in religious robes? Some scholars argue he used Buddhism the same way emperors use Christianity, unifying a divided land under one ideology. Others say he was genuinely transformed, that his conversion shaped his rule in ways that went beyond political convenience. Either way, it worked. You don't just unify pagan, you birth the first true Burmese empire. You standardize language, law, and liturgy. You create networks of temples and monasteries that double as centres of learning, diplomacy, and grain storage. You turn former bandits into governors, rival lords into monks, and dusty plains into cultural crossroads. You rule for decades. You grow older, wiser, and somehow even more disciplined. Your armies fight less. Your people eat more. For a kingdom once held together by robbery, pagan starts to resemble something almost holy. And when you die, the land mourns you not just as a king, but as a father, a protector, a builder. Your tomb becomes a pilgrimage site. Your name echoes in chants, in prayers, in the stones of pagodas that still stand 1,000 years later. You, Anarata, the bandit turned Buddhist, proved that power doesn't always have to destroy, that sometimes it can kneel, and then rise with something sacred in its hands. You're squatting on a crooked wooden stool, squinting into a bowl of murky water as you polish a nobleman's boots. The streets of Yuyao in eastern China are buzzing with gossip, vendors, and the occasional chicken darting between feet. You're Liu Ji, though soon the world will remember you as Liu Bowen. And at this point no one gives a second glance to the poor cobbler's boy with the ink-stained hands and calloused feet. You fix shoes by day, listen to tales by night, and memorise everything. You hear stories about ghosts and dragons, yes, but also about the Song dynasty's collapse and the Mongol Yuan Empire's cruel taxes. You learn from tea-house whispers and marketplace murmurings, not classrooms. You don't need school when the entire empire is writing its story in public. But your brain? It's not content with stories. You want systems, order, understanding. So you talk your way into a local school using charm and a little luck. You devour the classics, Confucius, Sun Tzu, Laozi. Strategy becomes your bread. Poetry becomes your breath. You pass the imperial exams, not just pass, but fly through them. Suddenly you're not a cobbler's boy anymore. You're a scholar official in the Yuan dynasty bureaucracy. But oh, the Yuan court is a mess. Corruption everywhere. Peasants rioting. The Mongol rulers, foreign and detached, bleed the countryside dry, while nobles argue about who insulted whom at which banquet. You can't fix that. Not yet. So you bide your time. You write poetry laced with political critique. You give advice that's only half followed. And when you're sick of the court's nonsense, you retire to the countryside with your books, your chessboard, and your burning frustration. And then a general named Zhu Yuanzhang finds you. He's rough, born of nothing, leading a rebel army against the Mongols. He doesn't know poetry, but he knows victory. He's charismatic, unpredictable, and absolutely destined for either greatness or a very messy death. He needs someone to plan, to scheme, to see the shape of power before it forms. And you're exactly that man. You come out of retirement and become his strategist. Think Chinese Gandalf meets Machiavelli with a side of meteorologist. You predict battles, weather, and the movement of enemy troops with terrifying accuracy. You tell Zhu to cut this riverbank, bribe that minister, wait out this siege. He listens and wins, again and again. Here's your quirky, possibly supernatural footnote of the night. People genuinely believed Liu Bowen could control the wind. That's not a metaphor. One legend claims you summoned a storm to break a Mongol fleet. Another says you predicted a drought down to the exact week. Scholars will point to your knowledge of astronomy and climate patterns, but locals still insist. Magic. Eventually Zhu Yunzhang becomes Emperor Hongwu, founder of the Ming dynasty, a peasant-born emperor ruling all of China, and behind him stands you, his Merlin, his ghostwriter, his razor-sharp conscience. But even that's not enough. You help draft the laws that stabilize the empire, you design tax systems, you build infrastructure, you propose reforms to stop corruption and limit aristocratic overreach, the kind of reforms that, ironically, will get you into trouble. Because here's where things go sour. Hongwu grows paranoid. Absolute power makes him twitchy. He sees enemies everywhere, especially among old friends who helped him rise. One by one, he eliminates his former allies. And you? You see it coming. So you retire again, claiming illness. You write cryptic poems. You hand off your duties to younger officials. You don't beg to stay. You don't protest. You simply vanish from court, quietly, with all your teeth intact, which, in that era, is kind of a retirement bonus. The scholarly debate around you is rich and thorny. Were you truly loyal to the end, or did you plant hidden warnings in your writings to undermine Hongwu's more brutal policies? Some argue you tried to save China from a tyrant by teaching him moderation. Others think you realised too late that you'd helped build a machine that would run without mercy. Whatever the case, your ghost lingers in court corridors long after your death, and your legacy, it's vast. You're remembered as one of the greatest strategists in Chinese history, so famous, in fact, that your name gets dragged into every conspiracy theory and folk tale imaginable. Some claim you predicted everything from future emperors to modern political shifts. Others say you hid secret texts that contain the fate of the world. One popular story insists you planted traps throughout the Ming capital to defend it in the event of an alien invasion. Not likely, but fun to imagine. You began with scraps, bare feet, hand-me-down books, and a brain that refused to quit. You ended as the architect behind the fall of one empire and the rise of another. You proved that intelligence, when paired with patience and just a touch of dramatic flair, could reshape the fate of a continent. You, Liu Bowen, turned a cobbler's life into a blueprint for dynasties. You're a girl tucked away in the cool stone corridors of a Benedictine abbey. The only sounds around you the slow scratch of quills and the echo of distant Gregorian chants. Outside, the forests of the Rhineland shift with wind and birdsong. Inside, you copy manuscripts under candlelight, too young to grasp the weight of the knowledge passing under your fingers. You've been given to the church, dedicated as a tithe child, because you're the 10th child in your family, and that's what gets offered when mouths outnumber coins. You don't speak loudly. You're often sick. But your mind crackles with something enormous. Your name is Hildegard, and you're about to become a storm in a nun's habit. Life in a convent isn't glamorous. It's discipline, obedience, fasting, and silence. But within these stone walls, you're free to think, read, and, eventually, speak. You start having visions young, vivid, blazing scenes of light, voices, and divine instructions. You try to ignore them, then to suppress them. But they won't leave. You think you're broken, or possessed, or maybe just lonely. Until finally in your 40s, yes, your 40s, you start to write them down. That's when it happens. The visions become books. Theology, yes, but also cosmology, medicine, botany, music. You don't just describe what you see, you explain it, interpret it, connect it to science, faith, and the human condition in ways no one has dared to before. You invent a personal symbolic language. You compose music so hauntingly beautiful that it still rings in cathedrals centuries later. You don't just play in the margins, you redraw them. And then, impossibly, you go public. You begin writing letters to bishops, emperors, even the Pope. You critique corruption. You call out moral decay. You urge reform. You tell kings how to rule, and wildest of all, they listen. You tour towns and cities preaching publicly, even though the church typically prefers its nuns quiet and cloistered. But you're no ordinary nun. You're a prophet, a scientist, a polymath, and something even rarer, a woman who speaks with divine authority. Here's your delightfully strange footnote for tonight. Hildegard claimed that many of her visions came with physical side effects, bright lights, dizziness, temporary blindness, and intense bodily sensations. Modern neurologists speculate she may have experienced migraines with aura, a possible explanation for her vivid experiences, which honestly only makes it cooler. You turned migraines into medieval theology. Eventually you found your own convent. Twice, actually. When male authorities try to control your location and activities, you politely, firmly, and persistently ignore them. You gather followers, students, copyists. You become an abbess, not just in title, but in full force. Your scriptorium buzzes with productivity. You dictate texts on everything from reproductive health to the healing properties of trees. You argue that the body is holy, the earth is sacred, and music is the bridge between human suffering and divine joy. It's radical, it's poetic, it's you. Scholars continue to argue over your visions. Were they divinely inspired? Medical phenomena? Political tools to gain a voice in a world built to silence you? The answer is probably yes to all. You knew your visions gave you license to speak, but what you said went far beyond safe, pious platitudes. You used divine authority to challenge hierarchy, gender norms, and intellectual boundaries, and you did it all while technically staying within the rules. And your music? Oh, Hildegard, your music. Monophonic chants, lilting and luminous, built with daring intervals and unpredictable phrasing. You didn't just copy the boys, you transcended them. Your compositions are sung today not out of obligation, but because they are genuinely breathtaking. By the time you're elderly, 81, a ridiculous age for the 12th century, you've published multiple volumes of theology, medicine, natural history, and musical works. You've mentored generations of scholars and priests. You've fought with archbishops and won. You've been investigated by church authorities and emerged untarnished. When you die, it isn't in obscurity, but surrounded by manuscripts and people who know they're witnessing the passing of someone who bent reality with nothing but intellect and ink. Centuries later, you'll be canonized, not immediately, not easily, but finally. And then, even more incredibly, you'll be named a Doctor of the Church, one of only 4 women in history to receive that title. You'll sit in that pantheon alongside Augustine and Aquinas, all from a little girl who started life in the silent corners of an abbey. You, Hildegard of Bingen, proved that knowledge, true, fearless, shimmering knowledge, needs no armour, no sword, no permission. It only needs a voice willing to rise. You're standing in a velvet-lined chamber with a gold basin beside you, a folded towel draped over one arm, and a job title that most people wouldn't dare say out loud. Groom of the Stool. Yes, stool, as in exactly what you think. It's your duty to help the king with your royal digestion. You handle towels, perfumes, sometimes even a bit of gentle encouragement. But don't laugh. This is no ordinary servant's job. This is proximity. This is power. Because when you're the only one trusted to assist a monarch in his most vulnerable moments, you learn things, secrets, habits, anxieties. You are Hugh Despencer the Younger. And you are about to weaponize bathroom access into a political career. Let's back up a bit. You're born into nobility, but the dusty, disappointing kind. Your family's fortunes rise and fall with alarming speed. Your father's a respected administrator, loyal to the crown, but your own inheritance is minor. You're ambitious, handsome in that sharp-chinned medieval way, and absolutely unwilling to live a quiet life as a forgettable second son. So you make your move. You attach yourself to Prince Edward, soon to become King Edward II of England. The court is already teeming with dangerous whispers and flashy favourites. First there's Piers Gaveston, whose influence enrages the nobles. After Gaveston's very messy execution, there's a vacuum. And you step right into it. Your relationship with Edward is close, let's call it that. Exactly how close is still debated. Some say political, others say romantic. Historians have argued over the intimacy, the letters, the attention. What's certain is that Edward trusts you more than anyone else. You become his companion, his advisor, and eventually his chamberlain. You whisper in his ear at council meetings. You sleep in chambers nearby. You, the man who once handed the king his towel, are now steering the ship of state. You acquire lands, lots of them, castles, titles, revenues from seized estates. You use legal tricks and outright bullying to take what you want, and Edward lets you. He wants you to have it. You become one of the richest, most powerful men in England. But wealth isn't enough. You want revenge too. You target those who crossed your father. You orchestrate executions, land seizures, humiliations. Your enemies multiply, but you don't care. You walk into Parliament like it's your private theatre. You wear clothes more regal than the king's. You humiliate the Queen, Isabella of France, by elbowing into the role she's supposed to play. Trusted confidant, political partner, co-ruler. Big mistake, because Queen Isabella is no shrinking violet. She's cunning, furious, and has a grudge like a well-sharpened dagger. She bides her time. While you and Edward spiral into corruption and cruelty, she finds an ally in exile. Roger Mortimer, a disgraced nobleman with more muscle than subtlety. Together they raise an army in France and invade England. And the best part? Most of the nobles welcome them. You've made so many enemies by now that no one lifts a sword in your defence. You flee with Edward, dragging treasure and regrets across the countryside, hiding in monasteries and barns. But you're caught. And not just caught, paraded through the streets. Here's your twisted, unforgettable footnote of the night. Your execution is legendary for its gruesomeness. They hang you, cut you down alive, castrate you, disembowel you, and then quarter your body. The message is loud and medieval. You rose too high, you got too close, and you flew too close to a very, very unstable royal son. The scholarly debate around you, it's rich and uncomfortable. Were you truly a corrupt tyrant, or just a convenient scapegoat for a failing king? Some historians argue you were targeted more for your class jumping and presumed intimacy with Edward than for your actual crimes. Others say your greed, arrogance, and cruelty made you impossible to ignore. It's likely both. You played the game hard and lost harder. But make no mistake, you changed the nature of power in Edward's England. You proved that influence wasn't about birth, it was about proximity. You were a low-ranking noble who made the royal chamber his war room. You didn't need armies when you had the king's ear, and, well, everything else. So yes, you died brutally, publicly. But for nearly a decade you were England's true ruler in everything but name. You, Hugh Despencer the Younger, the man who rose from chambermaid adjacent to puppet master, remind us that in medieval politics, the throne isn't the only seat of power. Sometimes, the most dangerous place in a kingdom is the bathroom. You're lurking in the underbrush, breath held, hand wrapped around the grip of a worn longbow. The woods are damp, thick with the smell of moss and old leaves, and somewhere not far behind you, there's the faint clatter of horseshoes and the muttered curses of a sheriff's men. Again. You shift your weight silently, listening. You've been hunted before, many times, but today you're not running. You're waiting, because this is your forest, your rules, and when the arrow flies, it finds its mark, as always. You're Robin, just Robin. The hood part will come later, after the legends twist you into someone more myth than man. Let's make one thing clear. You weren't born a legend. You weren't even born lucky. Whether you were a displaced noble's son, a runaway serf, or a former soldier who came back to find your land seized by some smug Norman baron, your story starts the same way, with loss. They took everything. Your home, your inheritance, your peace. So you did what every underdog secretly dreams of. You fought back. You disappeared into Sherwood Forest with a bow, a cause, and a steadily growing crew of misfits. Life in the Greenwood isn't comfortable. It's cold, damp, and crawling with fleas, but it's free. And for those who have nothing to lose, freedom tastes better than a roast duck in a noble's hall. Your companions are as wild as the land itself. There's little John, who's not little at all, much the miller's son, who sings off-key but swings an axe like he's baking bread. Will Scarlet, a bit too stylish for someone living in the dirt. And of course, the lady who haunts every outlawed love story, Maid Marian. She's sharp as flint, raised noble, but chooses you, ragged tunic and all. Your mission, at its core, is absurdly straightforward. Rob from the rich, give to the poor. But in a time when rich means tax-collecting barons and poor means half the country, it becomes a revolution. You ambush gold-laden convoys headed to Nottingham Castle. You redistribute loot to starving villagers. You carve fear into the hearts of men who thought iron rings and castle walls could keep them safe. The Sheriff of Nottingham, that pompous wart in fine velvet, becomes your sworn enemy. He swears he'll catch you. He never does. Here's your quirky, almost certainly fictional footnote of the night. Some stories say you once split an arrow lengthwise with another arrow during a tournament, blindfolded, in disguise, under a false name, while the king himself watched. Is it true? Almost definitely not. Does anyone care? Not even a little. Now let's wander into the scholarly thicket. Was Robin Hood real? And if so, who was he? The earliest references, scattered across legal records and ballads, date back to the 13th and 14th centuries. Robehod becomes a placeholder name for criminals and rebels, like John Doe for outlaws. Some say you were a yeoman, a class between peasant and noble. Others argue you were a disgraced knight. Still others believe you were a composite of many people, minor rebels whose names were lost to time but whose defiance inspired the myth. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Maybe you existed, maybe you didn't. But the idea of you? That had weight. You weren't just a man, you were a reaction to injustice, to tyranny, to kings like John who squeezed every copper penny from their subjects while playing at war and losing badly, to sheriffs who enforced cruel taxes and called it justice. And what about your king? In the legends, it's always Richard the Lionheart who returns and makes things right, who pardons you and restores balance. But history's a little less generous. Richard was often abroad, too busy crusading or being held for ransom to worry about a rogue archer in Sherwood. If he knew of you, it was likely with annoyance. If he ever pardoned you, it was probably with a price. Still, when you picture the ending, you like to imagine it soft. The king in disguise. A handshake. A royal pardon. The chance to live openly. No longer hiding among the brambles. But reality? Probably harsher. You likely died the way you lived. Bow in hand, heart defiant, somewhere deep in the forest. Maybe betrayed. Maybe just outnumbered. But never quiet. Never tame. And yet, your story refuses to stay dead. It spreads, across taverns, parchment, generations. Ballads are sung by firelight. Children wear your green cap and dream of justice with a slingshot in hand. Over the centuries you become anything the people need. A noble thief, a symbol of Saxon pride, a populist hero, a romantic rebel. You, Robin Hood, whoever you were, left no crown, no dynasty. Just an idea sharp enough to survive swords and time. And in a world ruled by gold and titles, sometimes that's the richest legacy of all. You're up before the sun, shoveling manure in a drafty stable, nose full of hay dust and sweat. Your hands are raw, your knees ache, and no one even knows your name. You're just a stable hand, one of dozens, working for a family with more debts than land. But there's something different about you, something restless, You listen when others talk politics. You watch soldiers ride past and wonder what it would feel like to hold a sword instead of a pitchfork. You aren't noble, you aren't even literate, but what you are is strong, patient, and absolutely unwilling to be forgotten. Your name is Charles. No titles, no land, no reason for the world to care. Not yet. But history is funny like that. It forgets kings and remembers warriors. You're Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, and you're going to shake the bones of Europe, starting from the stables and rising all the way to the throne you're technically never allowed to sit on. Let's set the scene. Early 8th century Frankish kingdom. The Merovingian kings are still wearing the crown, but they're basically glorified mascots at this point. The real power sits with the mayor of the palace, the guy who runs things while the king plays with shiny objects and signs whatever's put in front of him. Your dad, Pepin of Herstal, is that guy, a serious mover of pieces, but he dies suddenly. And here comes the twist. He leaves no legitimate heir. You're his illegitimate son, the spare, the footnote. Legally, you're not even in the line of succession. So of course you get thrown in prison. But you escape, because of course you do. You rally some troops, convince a few nobles, bribe the right bishops, and suddenly you're not a prisoner. You're a war leader. One battle leads to another. You crush one rival, then another. By sheer force of will, and, okay, a little political blackmail, you claw your way into power, not as king, not yet, but as de facto ruler of the Franks. You don't sit around sipping wine, you get to work. The Saxons are invading from the north, the Frisians from the sea. Muslim armies from the south have crossed into Iberia and are now threatening Gaul. You lead your forces like a man possessed, strategic, brutal, patient. You reform the military, centralise power, and take the first real steps toward unifying the Frankish realm. And then comes the big moment, 732 CE. The Umayyad Caliphate has pushed into southern France. Their general, Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi, is heading north fast, cities fall, churches burn, panic spreads like wildfire. And you do what legends are made of. At the Battle of Tours, also called Poitiers, you meet the invading forces. You don't charge recklessly. You anchor your men in a tight phalanx. You wait for hours, days. When the Umayyads finally attack, they break like waves against your wall of shields. When Abdul Rahman falls in battle, the invading army retreats. You win. Europe breathes again. Was it the decisive battle that saved Christian Europe from Muslim conquest? Some historians say yes. Others argue the threat was overstated, that the Umayyads were overextended and would have turned back anyway. But here's what no one argues. You stopped them. Cold. And from that day forward, your name is etched into the bedrock of Europe. Your fun footnote of the night. Despite being one of the most important military figures in European history, you never became king. You never wore a crown. You preferred the title Mayor of the Palace, which sounds like someone who hands out parking permits, but was, in your case, the man running an empire. You didn't need a shiny hat. You had a sword and results. But what you did do was lay the foundation. Your son Pepin the Short, yes, they really called him that, eventually takes the crown. And your grandson? A little guy named Charlemagne. You don't just found a dynasty. You birthed the Carolingian Empire, a line that shapes the entire course of medieval Europe. And it all started with you shoveling manure. Here's the scholarly debate that's still rumbling in academic halls like distant thunder. Were you motivated purely by politics and power, or by genuine religious conviction? Some paint you as the saviour of Christendom. Others see a shrewd warlord who used religion as a tool to unify factions. It's probably both. You were a hammer, sure, but you knew exactly where to strike. When you die, you're still not king, but you're buried with honours fit for one. And history remembers you not as a footnote, not as an illegitimate son, but as Charles Martel, the man who held back the tide, the man who pounded chaos into order. You rose from the stables to the battlefield, from the margins to the centre of history, not by bloodline, not by divine right, but by force, strategy, and a will harder than iron. You, Charles the Hammer, didn't need a throne to rule, just a battlefield. You're shackled in a stone cell, arms chained above your head, breathing in the damp stink of rust and sweat. You've been here for days, maybe weeks. It's hard to tell anymore. There's no light, no sound except the distant drip of water and the occasional rat skittering by. You're a prisoner, disgraced and discarded, a political inconvenience rotting in a corner of a crumbling jail somewhere in Aleppo. You could have stayed that way, another forgotten casualty in a long line of medieval power plays, but you're not built for quiet endings. You're Zengi, and chains won't be the last thing that hold you. Let's go back a bit. You were born into privilege of a sort. Your father was governor of Aleppo under the Seljuk Turks, but nothing about your early life suggests empire builder. The Turkish world in the early 12th century is a fractured puzzle of sultans, emirs, and constantly shifting alliances. The Crusaders have carved up chunks of the Levant, establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem and a few other Latin outposts. Everyone's fighting everyone. Muslim against Christian, Muslim against Muslim, Arab against Turk, Turk against Turk. And you watch, you bide your time. And when your father is murdered, you play it cool. You get imprisoned for picking the wrong ally. That's the cost of gambling in this world. But instead of crumbling in that cold cell, you think. You watch. You learn who betrays whom, who the real power players are. And when you're finally released, miraculously, or through some clever backroom deal, you step into the world not as a victim, but as a tactician with a long memory. You start small, Mosul, you claim it, defend it. Then you take Aleppo. That's big. Aleppo's not just any city. It's a key to the north, a centre of culture, trade, and political leverage. You consolidate power by cracking skulls and brokering peace, whichever works fastest. You rule with iron discipline, not popular, but effective. People call you brutal, you shrug. You're not here to be liked. You're here to build something permanent. Then you do something extraordinary. In 1144, you march your armies against the county of Edessa, a Crusader state long thought to be invincible. No one expects it. The Crusaders are busy fighting each other or squabbling over holy relics. You strike fast, precise, and you win. Edessa falls, the first major Crusader territory to collapse back into Muslim hands. It's seismic. Christian Europe gasps. Muslim leaders finally see a glimmer of hope. You, the former prisoner, have just redefined the rules. Here's your historical footnote of the night. The fall of Edessa was so shocking to Europe that it directly triggered the Second Crusade. That's right. Kings and popes scrambled into armour because you, a once imprisoned Turk, kicked over the table. Now, the debate among historians, it's all about your motivations. Were you a religious unifier, striking the first blow in what would become a long reconquest of Muslim lands? Or were you just a power-hungry warlord whose victory was more opportunistic than ideological? There's no clear answer. You didn't exactly write love poems to Islam in your spare time. But you did take the first real step toward pan-Islamic resistance against the Crusaders. Your legacy is complicated. You're no saint. You ruled with fear. You purged rivals. You had an almost supernatural knack for knowing when to be cruel and when to be generous. Your courts were efficient. Your armies disciplined. You didn't just fight Christians. You cracked down on fellow Muslim leaders who stood in your way, reshaping the fractured Islamic world into something slightly less chaotic. That groundwork, it matters, because the real star of the show, the man who would become the bane of Crusader legend, was your son, Nur al-Din, and his protégé, a guy named Salah ad-Din, Saladin. You built the base. You made it possible, and you didn't do it with gold or titles. You did it with scars, iron will, and the long memory of someone who once counted the days in a dark cell, vowing to make them pay. When you're assassinated, because of course you are, your enemies don't rejoice. They get nervous. Because now your son inherits a united region and a growing idea that the Muslim world can, and should, stand together. You, Zengi, the shackled prisoner, became the spark. You reminded a broken region that power doesn't just rise from thrones. Sometimes it rises from chains. You're serving meat in a smoky yurt to a man who may one day rule the world, or get stabbed before dinner. That's life in the Mongol court. You're Sorghaghtani Beki, a princess by blood but a servant by circumstance, married off as a political chess piece into the turbulent house of Tului, the fourth son of Genghis Khan. You're quiet, observant, unbothered by chaos. After all, you've grown up in it. You understand that power doesn't always sit on horseback swinging a sabre. Sometimes it sits on a felt rug watching, memorising every alliance, every slight, every weakness. Let's be clear, you're Kerit by birth, part of a Christian Mongol tribe. Yes, Christian. Nestorian, to be precise. That's your quirky footnote of the night. While most people imagine Mongol rulers as thunderous pagan warriors, their elite class was a bizarre salad of beliefs. You, a Christian, marry into a predominantly shamanist family, and that doesn't stop you from navigating the bloodthirsty maze of Mongol succession politics with eerie finesse. When Tolui dies, poisoned maybe, or perhaps a victim of his own hard-drinking lifestyle, you don't disappear. You rise. That's the secret of your legacy. You become more powerful as a widow than you ever were as a wife. You don't remarry, even though many advise it. You remain single, loyal to Tolui's memory, and that alone earns you respect in a society where loyalty was currency. You focus on your 4 sons. You don't raise them to be soft princes in silks. You raise them to rule. You hire teachers from across the empire, Muslims, Chinese scholars, Nestorian priests, and give your sons a broader education than most warlords could pronounce. You make sure they can speak multiple languages, read strategy, understand religion, and most of all lead. You build alliances behind the scenes. You're the whisper in the ear of generals, the quiet sponsor of clerics, the steward of your late husband's estates and armies. While others get drunk or go missing in battle, you're managing supply chains, marriage pacts, and troop movements. Then you make your boldest move. You secure the throne for your son, Mongke. Not the eldest grandson of Genghis, not the most bloodthirsty, but the one you trained, the one you watched and moulded. In 1251, he becomes the Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. You did that, not with swords, but with patience, precision, and a terrifying understanding of human ambition. The debate historians love to sink their teeth into: just how much power did you really wield? The Mongol world was patriarchal, harshly so, but you, Sorghaghtani, seemed to break every rule without anyone realizing it until it was too late. Some call you the real architect of the Mongol Empire's second generation, the woman who ensured that chaos didn't rip it apart after Genghis's death. Others argue your influence is overstated, that you were just exceptionally lucky, riding the wave of your husband's bloodline. But then again, how many other wives of Tolui's brothers ended up with dead children and burned estates? You didn't just survive, you expanded, and you didn't stop with Mongke. Your other sons, Kublai and Hulagu, became titans in their own right. Kublai Khan, the eventual founder of the Yuan dynasty in China. Hulagu Khan, the destroyer of Baghdad and founder of the Ilkhanate in Persia. Your blood didn't just rule, it redrew maps. Your most genius political stroke? You maintained a delicate religious neutrality. You were devout in your Nestorian Christian beliefs, but you never forced them on anyone. You funded Buddhist monasteries, Islamic schools, and Taoist shrines, depending on the region. You understood that empire wasn't about conversion. It was about harmony through clever tolerance. While other rulers tried to unify through belief, you unified through quiet respect. You die in 1252, barely recognized outside the court, but revered within it. No throne, no title, no empire in your name. But your sons rule half the known world. Your strategies ripple for generations. You built an invisible dynasty that worked because you never needed to wear a crown. You, Sorghaghtani Beki, served food to warlords and ended up feeding empires. You taught men to rule. You balanced knives in your hands without ever swinging them. And in the frozen steppes and sweltering palaces of the Mongol Empire, you proved that sometimes the greatest conqueror is the one who never raises her voice. You're standing in the shadowed silence of a medieval monastery, eyes lowered, chanting Latin with 30 other boys in woolen robes, none of whom understand half the words they're reciting. You're 13, cold, underfed, and secretly wondering if this is all life has to offer. You were born into a middling noble family in France, not poor, but certainly not prestigious, and no one's expecting greatness from you. They expect obedience, clean handwriting, maybe a comfortable priesthood someday if you don't screw it up. But even here, in the soft monotony of candlelight and manuscripts, your ambition hums beneath the surface. You're Armand Jean Duplessis. And eventually the world will know you as Cardinal Richelieu, the red-robed chess master behind the French throne. But before all that, you start as a scared kid in a monastery library. You weren't even supposed to be the one in church service. That honour belonged to your older brother, but when he bailed, because who wouldn't, you were forced into it instead. You train, you study, you rise through the ranks by doing what others won't, noticing. You watch how abbots manipulate power through whispers, how bishops control their flocks with sermons that sound like lullabies, but cut like razors. You memorize names, alliances, patterns. You don't just learn the rules, you begin quietly rewriting them in your head. By your mid-20s, you're a bishop, and not just any bishop. You're one of the youngest in France. You're charming, calculating, brilliant, and terrifyingly efficient. And it turns out you have a taste for politics. When the crown needs a new voice in the clergy, they tap you, and that's when you do the thing that will define the rest of your life. You step out of the pulpit and into the throne room. France at this moment is in shambles. The nobles are arrogant, divided, and only loosely loyal to the crown. The Protestants are forming armed enclaves. The monarchy is weak. The Habsburgs are breathing down from Austria and Spain, and every French province thinks it's a tiny kingdom. The king, Louis XIII, is decent, but overwhelmed. And then he finds you. Or maybe you find him. Either way, the outcome's the same. You become his chief minister. The real ruler, if we're being honest. You wear the red robes of a cardinal, but beneath them is iron. You don't believe in soft power. You believe in stability, achieved at any cost. You centralize authority, you break the nobility, literally. You ban them from maintaining private armies and raise their castles if they push back. You turn regional governors into obedient royal agents. You silence dissent in the name of national unity. And the king lets you, because you get results. Here's your delightfully strange footnote. You once ordered the construction of a grand palace theatre in Paris, a personal obsession, and helped found the Académie Française, the institution that still regulates the French language today. So yes, while you were busy dismantling rebellions and outmanoeuvring Spain, you also made time to regulate grammar, power and punctuation. Of course, your greatest obsession is crushing the Habsburgs, the massive imperial family controlling Spain, Austria and chunks of the Holy Roman Empire. You play the 30 Years' War like a grandmaster, funding Protestant armies abroad while enforcing Catholic dominance at home. It's not about religion for you, it's about France. You once famously said, "If you give me 6 lines written by the hand of the most honest man, I will find something in them which will hang him." People remember that quote for good reason. And here's where the historians start rubbing their temples. Were you a hero or a villain? Some paint you as a monster, ruthless, authoritarian, obsessed with control. Others see you as the saviour of France, the only man who could drag the kingdom from medieval feudal chaos into early modern nationhood. You're Machiavellian, no doubt, but you're also visionary, and unlike most political puppeteers, you don't amass wealth for wealth's sake. You don't build a private army. You don't crown yourself king in all but name. What you build is France itself, centralised, powerful, unified. A country no longer run by squabbling dukes but by policy, laws and something dangerously close to modern government. You fall ill later in life, weak but still dangerous. You choose your successor before you die. You make sure the young Louis XIV, yes, that Louis, has the support he needs to continue your work. Your fingerprints are all over his future reign. The Sun King gets the spotlight. You lit the fuse. When you die, you're both feared and admired. People say prayers for your soul and whisper curses at your name, but no one forgets you. No one ever will. You, Richelieu, the sickly kid who started in a monastery, rose not just to command kings, but to reforge a nation. You proved that real power doesn't need a crown. It needs conviction, strategy, and a perfectly sharpened quill. You're kneeling beside an anvil, sweat streaking down your face as you hammer red-hot iron into the shape of something deadly. Sparks fly up and bite your arms, but you don't flinch. You've done this 100 times before, maybe 1,000. You're a blacksmith's apprentice in the swirling chaos of Sengoku-era Japan, a time when daimyo fight like gods and farmers are conscripted like cattle. Your name isn't written in any scroll, and your master barely pays you enough to keep rice in your bowl, but that's fine, because you're not planning to be a blacksmith forever. You're watching, learning, waiting. Because soon, you're going to trade your hammer for a sword and forge a legend instead. Your name is Yamamoto Kansuke, or at least that's how you'll be remembered. Truth is, no one's entirely sure where you were born or who your parents were. Some say you were the illegitimate son of a minor samurai. Others say you were a runaway peasant who talked his way into the samurai class. All anyone knows for certain is that one day, seemingly from nowhere, a one-eyed, limping warrior appears on the political chessboard of Japan, and nothing's quite the same after. Let's set the scene. Japan is fractured. Dozens of feudal lords are battling for land, honour and control. It's like Game of Thrones, but with more cherry blossoms and far more ritual suicide. Among these warlords is Takeda Shingen, brilliant, ruthless, poetic and ambitious. You make your way into his service not through pedigree, but with your brain. You're not the strongest fighter on the battlefield, but you're the smartest. You know how to win before the first blade is drawn. You become Shingen's chief strategist, his spy master, his war wizard. Your plans are unorthodox, laying traps, faking retreats, exploiting terrain in ways no one else dares to try. One of your most famous tactics involves faking a surrender just long enough to lure an enemy into a gorge, then slaughtering them from above. Elegant, efficient, bloody. Here's your weird, oddly inspiring footnote for the night. Some accounts say you walked with a limp and had only one eye, which made you a target of mockery among the more traditional samurai. But you turned that mockery into mystique. Enemies whispered that you could see the battlefield with supernatural clarity, that your physical flaws were disguises for a mind sharper than any katana. Whether true or exaggerated, your image became a kind of living myth. Your greatest triumph, the fourth battle of Kawanakajima, 1561. It's one of the most famous samurai clashes in history. You devise a two-pronged attack, lure the enemy out of their stronghold, then strike from behind. It's genius, on paper. But the enemy general, Wasugi Kenshin, sees through it. The result? A brutal, glorious disaster. Tens of thousands die. Neither side wins. Some say you commit seppuku, ritual suicide, in shame over the failure. Others claim you died fighting, sword drawn, a warrior to the end. But even in defeat you become a legend. A strategist who changed the rules of war. A commoner, or close enough, who rose through sheer intellect. You weren't born into power. You built it. One plan at a time. One night sketching troop movements under flickering candlelight. One whispered bribe to the right gatekeeper. While other samurai wrote poetry and bragged about their family lineages, you carved your name in the margins of maps. And now comes the debate. Because history loves a mystery. Some scholars argue that you're more myth than man, a fictional invention of the Takeda clan to justify their military strategies. Others believe you were very real, and your eccentricities only grew in legend after death. Either way, your presence on the battlefield was undeniable. You turned logic into a weapon, humility into a mask, and war into a kind of theatre. You weren't the most decorated, you weren't the most feared, but you were the most unpredictable. And in a world ruled by tradition and protocol, unpredictability is power. So here's what matters. You started with nothing. No land, no title, maybe not even a full set of limbs. But you rose not by lifting a sword first, but by knowing exactly when to lift it and where to aim. You, Yamamoto Kansuke, are proof that even in the rigid class cages of feudal Japan, there's room for the odd, the broken, the underestimated. You didn't just break the mould, you made it irrelevant. You're barefoot, breathless, and gripping the hem of your dress so it doesn't trip you as you sprint down a muddy alley in Paris, parchment tucked under your arm like contraband. You've just slipped out of the back of a scriptorium where you copied 3 lines of Latin poetry for a nobleman too lazy to read it himself. He'll pay you half of what it's worth, of course, and you'll be grateful because you need every coin. You're Christine de Pizan, and no one expects you to matter. You're a woman, a widow, and worse, a writer. You were born in Venice, raised at the glittering French court, the daughter of an Italian court astrologer who thought maybe, just maybe, his daughter should learn more than embroidery. He taught you Latin, let you read philosophy, let you ask questions that made priests shift uncomfortably. That alone made you rare. Then came the harder lessons. You married young, happily. But happiness in medieval Europe has a short shelf life. Your husband dies of plague or fever. It doesn't really matter, does it? The crown stops paying your father's pension. Your children are still small. You have no protector. Just a stack of books and a hunger to prove you can stand where no woman's allowed. So you do something unheard of. You pick up a pen. You write love poems first, sweet and safe, signed with your name, not hidden behind a man's. Then you write ballads, epistles, allegories. People notice. Some of them even pay you. A woman, being paid to write. Not just for other women either. Noblemen, scholars, even dukes commission your work. You're not just writing now. You're earning, feeding your family with ink. Then you make your move. You publish the Book of the City of Ladies. It's a literary broadside, a declaration of war dressed as a mirror of virtue. In it you build an imaginary city brick by brick with stories of women, real and mythic, who are strong, wise, clever, loyal, brave. You use their stories to argue, gently but firmly, that women are not inherently inferior, that history has ignored, misrepresented and distorted them. You don't scream, you don't burn things, you just build a better story and invite the reader inside. Here's your remarkable little footnote for the night. Christine de Pizan is considered the first professional female writer in European history. That's right, first. In an era where women were considered property or sin incarnate, you published under your own name, supported yourself and your children, and did it all without a noble title or a husband's fortune. Your most famous intellectual brawl? That would be the Querelle de la Rose, a fiery public debate over the wildly popular but wildly misogynistic Romance of the Rose. You wrote letter after letter challenging its depiction of women as deceitful seductresses, and instead of being ignored or dismissed, you were answered, in print, by men who were stunned and a little scandalised that a woman knew how to use a semicolon and throw shade at the same time. And here's the scholarly conversation that never ends. Were you a proto-feminist, centuries ahead of your time, or were you simply defending the value of good women within a framework that still accepted male authority? You upheld the church, you praised virginity and chastity, but you also tore apart double standards and demanded education for women. You were both radical and traditional, subversive and devout. Later in life, you go quiet. War tears through France. The 100 Years' War drags on like a bad dinner guest. You retire to a convent with your daughter, and then, when you're already in your 60s, basically ancient by medieval standards, you write one more book. This one about a girl in armour, a teenager, leading armies, wearing pants, hearing voices. Her name is Joan, Joan of Arc. You call her the most valiant of all women, and with that, your pen finally rests. When you die, you leave behind something extraordinary. Not just books, but a blueprint. For women, for thinkers, for anyone who's ever been told they don't belong in a room full of scrolls and ink and decisions. You, Christine de Pizan, started with nothing but grief and a borrowed library card. You wrote your way into history, and while others tried to paint women into corners, you built a city of ladies instead. You're standing on the deck of a ship that smells like salt, sweat and cannon smoke, your sea wind-tangled hair tied back with a strip of cloth stolen from an English soldier's sleeve. You squint toward the Irish coast, scanning the horizon for sails. You're not waiting for invaders, you are the invader, a pirate, a noble, a mother, a chieftain, a storm in a bodice. You're Grain Nimhaile, better known as Grace O'Malley, and the men in your world have no idea what to do with you, except maybe write letters begging you to stop stealing their stuff. You're born around 1530 into the O'Malley clan of Connaught, Western Ireland, a seafaring people, independent and fierce, with zero interest in being ruled by English kings or anyone else who doesn't know how to handle a boat. Your father is Johann Dubdara O'Malley, a respected chieftain, and you grow up learning to sail, navigate, negotiate, and probably knife fight by age 10. When you ask to go on a trading voyage with your father and he says no, because girls don't sail, you respond by chopping off your hair and sneaking aboard anyway. The sailors nickname you Green Maul, or Bald Grace, and the legend begins. You marry young, of course, that's expected. You wed Donald O'Flaherty, another chieftain. He's loud, brash, and prone to getting into feuds. When he's killed, ambushed by a rival clan, you take over his fortress immediately. No council meeting, no formal ceremony, just you, sword drawn, flanked by loyal warriors, reclaiming the stronghold before it can fall into enemy hands. You become the head of the clan not because anyone gives you permission, but because no one can stop you. You remarry later, but only after negotiating terms that would make a modern divorce lawyer proud. I'll marry you, you say, for 1 year. Just like that, you get property rights and legal protection, and when the year's up, you leave. In some stories, you lock your husband out of the castle and yell, "I dismiss you," from a tower window. Iconic, if true. You command fleets, you raid merchant ships, you forge temporary alliances with the English when it suits you, then break them just as easily. You collect taxes, well, protection money, from ships sailing along the western coast. You fight off rival clans and English garrisons with equal intensity. You raise children between naval battles. You speak Latin, Gaelic, and probably enough English to shout insults across the deck. Tonight's odd but true footnote: Grace once stormed into a castle to confront the man who murdered her lover. When she found him at dinner, she stabbed him right at the table, then turned to the rest of the guests and said, "Continue your meal. I won't delay you further." That's not etiquette. That's presence. But here's where things get even more interesting. Queen Elizabeth I, yes, that Elizabeth, hears about you, about your raids, your navy, your absolute refusal to kneel, and instead of sending an army again, she invites you to court. You, an Irish pirate queen, sail to London in 1593 to meet the Virgin Queen herself. You refuse to bow. You refuse to speak English, using Latin instead. You complain about English officials stealing your lands. You request the release of your imprisoned son. And astonishingly, Elizabeth agrees. Two queens, both operating outside the rules of their respective systems, recognise something in each other. The historians argue about what that something was. Mutual respect, political convenience, a grudging admiration between two women who ruled not by inheritance but by force of will. No one knows for sure, but it happened. The letters survive. The request was granted. Of course, the English still don't leave Ireland alone. You go back to fighting, to defending your clan. You live into your 70s, possibly even longer, which is like living to 100 today. You die not in exile or disgrace, but in your home territory, still a legend, still commanding respect, still herself. And here's the best part. Your story doesn't vanish into folklore. It gets passed down. You're remembered in poems, in school books, in songs belted out by the descendants of rebels. You're not just a pirate or a noble or a warrior. You're a symbol of resistance, of autonomy, of fierce, unshakable identity. You, Grace O'Malley, born to waves and defiance, built your own throne from driftwood and blood and dared monarchs to tell you otherwise. Section 22. You tumble into the great hall doing cartwheels, bells jingling from the tips of your shoes, painted smile stretched across your face while a room full of lords and bishops chuckle from their gilded thrones. You're the court jester, the clown, the harmless idiot. No one worries what you hear, because why would a fool understand politics? But they don't realise that under the hat and motley is a razor mind, a fluent tongue, and ears tuned like a musician's to the subtlest tremor in a lie. You're not here just to dance and crack jokes. You're here to listen, to watch, to remember. And when the time is right, you whisper what you've learned into the right ears, and everything changes. Your name has long since been forgotten, or maybe it was never known at all. You live in the 14th century Castile, a kingdom in what is now Spain, where thrones change hands faster than a gambler's dice, and every royal feast is served with a side of poison. The king's court is a viper pit dressed in velvet, and you, the jester, are the only one who can speak the truth without losing your head. Let's get one thing straight. You're not an accident. You chose this. Or maybe it chose you. You were born into nothing. A street urchin? A servant's bastard? A child tossed into an orphanage because your parents couldn't afford to keep you? No one cares. What matters is you survived. You learned to juggle apples for bread, to sing songs for strangers' coins, to perform little tricks that made people stop, smile, and, more importantly, let down their guard. Eventually you catch the eye of a minor noble. He brings you to court for a laugh. You give him 10, and within a week you're standing in front of the king himself, entertaining his majesty with a flawless impersonation of his biggest rival. Everyone laughs, the king most of all. You're in, and once you're in, you never stop climbing. You become the royal fool, not just entertainment, but a constant presence. You sit near the throne, invisible but always listening. You know which dukes are lying. You know which alliances are fragile. You know when war is coming before the generals do. You wrap your insights in riddles, lacing your barbs with rhyme and rhyme with subtext. Sometimes you're ignored, sometimes you're not. Sometimes your warnings prevent bloodshed, other times they seal a traitor's fate. Here's your quirky historical gem of the night. In medieval Spain, jesters were sometimes granted full access to diplomatic meetings under the guise of providing lightness in tense moments. But their real job, spying, and not just for the king. Some jesters were double agents, feeding information to rival factions in exchange for gold or safe passage. History forgot their names, but their echoes remain in the sudden shifts of policy that followed a single whisper. Now here's where the historians get fidgety. How much power did jesters really have? Were they merely tolerated oddities, or were they the kingdom's most dangerous confidants? Some scholars argue jesters were little more than overpaid court pets. Others insist they operated like informal intelligence officers, trusted because they were underestimated. You were one of the dangerous ones. You understood the system better than anyone because you existed outside it. You had no title to protect, no land to defend, just your mind, your tongue, and your perfect timing. You even survived regime change. When the king died and his brother took the throne, you changed your act slightly, different accents, different targets, but kept your seat by the fire. You were nobody's fool, after all. You were your own. Eventually, rumours start to swirl that you arranged assassinations, that you smuggled coded messages inside jokes, that one of your riddles actually sparked a rebellion. Do we have proof? Not really. But people still whisper them centuries later, and that tells you something. You die quietly, in a castle or on the road, depending on which legend you believe. Some say you took your secrets to the grave. Others say you trained a successor, a girl dressed as a boy perhaps, who learned to hide truth in comedy just as well as you did. No tombstone marks your grave, no statue bears your likeness, but the kingdom you once served still remembers the role you played, because fools were the only ones allowed to speak the truth in a world drowning in lies. You, the nameless jester, slipped through history's cracks, not as a king or warrior or noble, but as the whisper in the room no one dared silence. You proved that power sometimes wears bells, not crowns. You're standing ankle-deep in clay, your tunic smudged with charcoal, and your hands trembling as you sketch a design in the dirt with a twig. It's not much, just a quick study of a bird's wing mid-flap. But even now, even like this, the movement is alive under your fingers. You don't know it yet, but that wing is going to carry you out of obscurity. You're the illegitimate son of a notary and a peasant woman, born in a Tuscan village called Vinci, and your name is Leonardo. No last name, no fancy titles, just Leonardo from Vinci. The world will know you as Leonardo da Vinci, but here, right now, you're just a curious, awkward boy with too many thoughts and nowhere to put them. You grow up on the margins, not quite noble, not quite poor. Your father acknowledges you but doesn't bother legitimizing you. That means no formal schooling, no university, no access to the white-robed institutions where the sons of Florence learn Latin and Aristotle. You're stuck with back doors and borrowed books, but you watch, you listen, you break things open to see how they work. Birds, locks, plants, toys, it doesn't matter. Everything is a puzzle begging to be solved. When you're around 14, your father pulls some strings to place you as an apprentice in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence. This is no ordinary workshop. It's a hive of painters, sculptors, metalworkers and engineers. You fit in instantly, except you don't. Because even here, among prodigies, you think differently. You stay up late, sketching anatomical studies. You argue about shadow and movement and proportion with men twice your age. You make small things, paintings, tools, designs, but they feel like fragments of something bigger, something not even you can name yet. Then, one day, Verrocchio asks you to paint an angel in his latest work, the baptism of Christ. You do, and when the painting is revealed, everyone sees it. Your angel is better than the master's, smoother, softer, alive. Legend has it Verrocchio never picked up a brush again. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter. You're on your way. But fame isn't a straight road. You start projects you don't finish. You move from city to city, Florence to Milan to Rome to France, always chasing commissions, fleeing jealous rivals, or simply following a new obsession. You paint masterpieces and abandon others halfway through. You sketch helicopters and diving suits centuries before they're viable. You write thousands of pages of notes, most of them in mirror script, left-handed and backward. Not because you're hiding secrets, but because it's easier that way. You think sideways, and your hand follows. Here's your marvellously strange footnote of the night. Among your many fascinations is the way water moves when it hits a rock. You filled dozens of pages with drawings of eddies, splashes and swirls. You weren't just interested in the art of it. You were trying to understand it. Physics, engineering, nature. It all blurred together in your mind. You were centuries ahead of fluid dynamics and didn't even know it. But here's the thing about your rise. It isn't meteoric, it's messy. You're a misfit genius in a world that demands patrons, favours and social graces. You're notoriously slow. Your last supper nearly flakes off the wall because you experimented with a new technique that didn't work. You leave Florence without finishing the Adoration of the Magi and Mona Lisa. You work on her for years, tweaking her smile, repainting layers, never quite letting her go. And yet, people come to you. Kings, dukes, popes. They want you to paint, sculpt, design war machines, host court entertainments, consult on fortifications. You accept with that shy half-smile, and then promptly spend half your time dissecting corpses or trying to build a mechanical lion. You're never predictable, never normal, but always fascinating. Now, historians love to argue. Were you the quintessential Renaissance man, or a brilliant dreamer who lacked follow-through? Some say you had too many interests to master any of them. Others say you mastered everything, just not in ways your contemporaries could recognise. You didn't write treatises or establish schools. You didn't train famous disciples. But your notebooks, those notebooks, became your legacy. A treasure map of a mind that refused to stop asking questions. You die in France, in the service of King Francis I, who reportedly cradled your head as you passed, though that might be poetic embellishment. Your unfinished works remain scattered, your inventions never built, your reputation complicated. But centuries later, the world digs up your notebooks and realises you weren't just a painter. You were a scientist, an engineer, an anatomist, an architect, a philosopher. You weren't ahead of your time. Your time simply wasn't fast enough to catch you. You, Leonardo da Vinci, illegitimate and unschooled, drew the future with the ink of curiosity, and dared to dream in directions no one had yet imagined. You're 12 years old and shackled. Your hands are raw from the chains, your back aching from the days of travel across the sands of Central Asia, and your name, whatever it used to be, is gone now. You've been bought, sold, shoved into a barracks full of boys who don't speak your language, don't know your past, and frankly, don't care. You're Mamluk now, a slave soldier, property of the Sultanate of Egypt, but that title doesn't mean what it sounds like. Because in this strange, upside-down system, being a slave could be your one-way ticket to power. If you survive, your name will become Baybars, and before long everyone in the Islamic world, kings, crusaders, caliphs, will know it. Mamluks aren't like other slaves. They're trained, intensively. You learn to fight from the moment you arrive. Swordplay, archery, horse riding. You memorize Quranic verses, study battlefield formations, eat just enough to keep your muscles sharp and your will stronger. You sleep on the floor, dream of freedom, and rise each day with a little more fire in your gut. Because here's the secret. If you're good enough, brutal enough, smart enough, you can rise. Mamluks can become generals, governors, even sultans. And you're better than good. You cut your teeth on campaigns against the Mongols, whose advance westward has been a flaming scythe across Eurasia. Cities fall like dominoes. Even the mighty Abbasid Caliphate is reduced to rubble. But Egypt stands, and with you among its defenders, it fights back. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the unthinkable happens. The Mongols lose. You're not yet the supreme commander, but your role is pivotal. You don't just survive the chaos, you study it. And when the moment comes, when leadership falters and the throne wobbles, you move. You depose the current sultan, quietly, efficiently. There's no bloodbath, just a reshuffling, like someone clearing a board for a better player. You take the title of Sultan of Egypt and Syria, from slave to sovereign, from foreign captive to ruler of a kingdom that straddles 2 continents. Now you get to work. You don't rule from a cushion. You lead from horseback, blade on your hip, armour dusty. You rebuild the military. You reinforce cities. You push back the Crusaders and erase their footholds one by one. Antioch, you flatten it. Acre, next. You do not negotiate with people who cross your border with crosses on their shields. To your people, you become the sword of Islam. To your enemies, you're the embodiment of cold, disciplined vengeance. But here's the quirky footnote for tonight. You were originally rejected from the royal bodyguard because of your appearance. Some chroniclers say you had one eye slightly off-centre, or that your skin was darker than others. You weren't beautiful in the polished, poetic sense, and that made your rise even more shocking. No noble lineage, no angelic features, just talent, force, and a very sharp sense of timing. There's debate, of course. Historians love to poke at your legacy. Were you a religious zealot, a populist reformer, a tyrant wrapped in piety? Some say you ruled with terror. executing rivals on the mere whiff of betrayal. Others argue you stabilised a crumbling region and protected it from total collapse under Mongol and Crusader pressure. The truth, as usual, is both. You patronised architecture, building mosques, madrasas and fortifications. You negotiated with the remaining Abbasid caliphs to give your rule religious legitimacy. You turned Cairo into a capital not just of power, but of culture. And every decision, every calculated brutality, every hard-won battle was about control, not for ego, but for survival. You die in 1277 suddenly, possibly poisoned. Of course, no one ascends that high without enemies, but your legacy doesn't vanish with your last breath. The Mamluk Sultanate you helped forge rules for centuries. It becomes one of the most stable regimes in the Islamic world. The Crusaders never fully recover, the Mongols stay east, and your memory grows, shaped by poets and chroniclers into something massive. The boy who once scrubbed floors in a foreign palace becomes a symbol of resistance and discipline. You are remembered not as a fluke, but as a turning point. Proof that status can be shattered, that strength can outshine bloodline, that greatness can be seized. You, Baybars, the captive who refused to stay caged, carved your throne from the battlefield and built an empire that remembered your name long after the chains rusted away. You're born in the wind-scoured steppe, wrapped in coarse wool, surrounded by horses, hardship, and a horizon so wide it looks like it could swallow the world. There's no cradle, no castle, no fortune-teller pointing out your destiny. Just goats, rocks, and the occasional enemy tribe. You grow up fast, faster than most, because the world doesn't wait for the slow, and in the highlands of Transoxiana, modern-day Uzbekistan, there's no room for second chances. Your name is Timur. You'll be called the Lame after a childhood leg injury, but history will call you far more terrifying things before it's through. Let's make this clear. You're not Genghis Khan's grandson. You just say you are. Everyone wants to claim a piece of the Mongol legacy, and you're no different. But while others brag, you build. You're born into a minor Turkic Mongol clan, noble-ish maybe, but definitely not at the top of the food chain. As a young man, you join the retinue of a warlord, fighting raiders, rustling cattle, carving out little bits of territory. You're cunning, fearless, and absolutely unshakable. And then comes the injury, an arrow to the leg that leaves you with a permanent limp. You should have been left behind, forgotten. Instead, you adapt. You fight smarter, more brutally. You learn diplomacy like it's a battlefield. Flank, strike, retreat, lie, smile. You play tribes against each other, pretend to support puppet khans, and slowly, inch by inch, take. You're never officially the ruler, not in the beginning. You're just the power behind the throne, the whisper in the tent, the man with the loyalty of the army and the quiet agreement of terrified rivals. Then you stop pretending. You sweep through Central Asia with an iron will and a very literal iron fist. You build a capital, Samarkand, shimmering with Persian mosaics and skull pyramids. Yes, actual skulls. You leave them outside cities as reminders. You're not subtle. You don't do subtle. Baghdad, razed, Delhi, looted, Damascus, burned. You justify it all as righteous conquest, a cleansing fire sent by heaven, and you carry scholars, artisans, and scribes back to Samarkand to craft your legacy in gold leaf and turquoise tile. Here's your absolutely bananas fact of the night. You once claimed to be the sword of Islam, while simultaneously employing Christian engineers, Buddhist architects, and anyone else useful. You were an equal opportunity conqueror, and your cultural tolerance extended exactly as far as your tactical advantage. The second someone resisted you, fire, steel, gone. And here's the scholarly debate, whispered through academia like a cautious footstep across a minefield. Were you a brutal destroyer or a strategic genius? A Mongol pretender with a god complex, or the last great nomadic emperor before the rise of gunpowder and borders? Some historians see you as a military savant, a logistical mastermind who moved armies like puzzle pieces and reshaped entire economies. Others see a war criminal with a better PR department. And then there's the part no one quite agrees on. Your death. In 1405 you set out on one last campaign against China. Because of course you do. You're 70, you're arthritic, you can barely walk, but you're planning to conquer the Ming dynasty anyway. And then, fever, collapse, gone. You leave behind a body wrapped in silk and a world terrified of what you would have done had you lived longer. Your mausoleum, the Gure Amir, is a thing of beauty. Your empire less so. It doesn't last. Your heirs bicker, crumble, scatter, but the echoes remain. You influence the rise of the Mughals, who will one day claim descent from you. Your image is etched into memory as the man who out-Genghised Genghis, if not in scale, then certainly in style. You're feared, cursed, admired. You're what happens when ambition finds a sword and a limp doesn't slow the stride. And you never flinched. Not from arrows, betrayal, fire, or death. You, Timur the Lame, rose from a shepherd's dust to drape the world in blood and silk. You weren't born into empire, you built it. On bone, on brilliance, and on the sheer, unyielding will of a man who refused to crawl when he could still limp toward glory. You've travelled through stables and palaces, pig pens and battlefields, parchment-stained libraries and flaming cities. You've sat in the shadows of kings, eaten dust beside rebels, and shared fires with prophets who weren't supposed to be anything at all. These 30 stories, 30 wild, unpolished, improbable leaps from obscurity to greatness, are reminders that history is not just written by the victors. It's written by the ones who refused to stay where the world put them. Not all of them were kind. Not all of them were heroes. Some ruled with compassion, others with an iron boot. Some fought for faith, some for vengeance. Some because survival was the only way to scream back at a world built to crush them. But every one of them, every last soul you met tonight, proved that beginnings don't define endings. A boy born without a surname became the unifier of Japan. A widow soaked in grief turned a forest tribe into an empire. A pirate faced down a queen. A beggar wrote herself into the centre of European literature. A slave outwitted his masters and ruled from a throne. And you were there for all of it. You stood in William Marshal's armour as he aged into myth. You felt Ivailo's calloused fingers clench around a makeshift spear. You sat beside Christine as she wrote her truths by candlelight. You tasted salt on Grace O'Malley's lips, still laughing at kings. You limped through battle with Timur, dragging history behind you like a banner stitched from fire. What started as stories of rags and riches turned into something more human, raw, brilliant, flawed, and real. These weren't miracles. They were long, jagged climbs carved by grit and vision, and the kind of stubbornness that keeps someone pushing forward even when no one is watching. So if you ever feel buried by the weight of where you come from, or if the world whispers that your place is fixed and small, remember them. Remember the stableboy who crowned kings, the swineherd who toppled them, the jester with daggers in his jokes, the saint who kissed lepers and sang in the dirt, the scribes, the soldiers, the ones who had nothing but refused to stay nothing. They were overlooked. So are you, maybe. But overlooked is not the same as invisible. Sleep now, you've earned it. Tomorrow maybe start your own legend.